Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Caleb Zachrin, editor of the New Books Network. Today I'm speaking with Ciara Green, co-author with Gillian Murphy of the new book, Memory Lane: The Perfectly Imperfect Ways We Remember. Ciara is associate professor in the School of Psychology at University College Dublin, where she leads the Attention and Memory Laboratory. The scientific study of human memory has become even more relevant in an age where we have every technology under the sun to alleviate us of the need to remember. It makes sense that we worry about losing the ability to remember today. But even Socrates 2,500 years ago lamented that the recently invented technology of writing harmed people's ability to remember. Memory not only connects us with our past, but it instructs us on how we should behave, what we should believe, and underlies the patterns of our everyday thoughts. Memory Lane takes readers behind the most up-to-date scientific research on memory. How memory actually works versus how we think it works is a wide chasm, and Ciara and Gillian are excellent guides for bridging the gap. Ciara, thanks for joining me today on the New Books Network.
Thanks for having me, Caleb.
Of course, this book was so fascinating, and I was really excited to talk to you today about it because one of my fondest school memories was doing a project on the scientist Eric Kandel and his research on memory, and I found it a really fascinating topic. Memory, obviously, the more you think about it, the more you realize that memory kind of underlies everything. And I was just utterly fascinated by the research that Eric Kandel did. And, I wanted to know what's the most up-to-date scientific research on it. And your book does a great job of telling readers, basically what scientists and psychologists know right now and making it very relevant, teasing out all the implications. So, it was really just a wonderful read. But before jumping to the book, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So my first degree was in psychology, and then I did a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. And in my postdoctoral work, I used to focus on kind of really the neural level of cognition. So I would put people in brain scanners and MRI scanners, and I would have them do memory tasks, and I would evaluate what regions of the brain were activated when they were doing that. And I did that for several years, and it was fine, and it was interesting. But I started to become concerned that a lot of that work wasn't really getting to the nub of a lot of the questions that I was really interested in about, how our memory actually works in the real world and how it affects our day-to-day lives. And then about 10, 12 years ago, I moved to my first faculty post in University College Cork, and that's where I met Gillian. So Gillian was my first PhD student. So I was a baby supervisor, she was a baby student, and we started working together, and we very quickly realized that we worked really, really well together. So we were initially working on a project about attention, but over time we realized that really our interests really lay in the area of memory. So over the last decade or so, we've worked together really closely on a huge range of projects. I moved to another university. Gillian is now an assistant or a senior lecturer in associate professor at UCC. I'm over at UCD. And we have, a lot of different projects that we work on independently of each other, but we also have a lot of overlap in our work. And we work together on a really wide variety of projects investigating kind of everyday memory and the various ways that our memories can be distorted, can be changed, and how new information can change the way we remember our lives.
I love that. There have been so many times now where I've spoken to someone who's a co-author, and turns out that the relationship is advisor-advisee, and it's so great to hear that. The relationship
Time ago, it's not anymore.
Right now, hiring from advisor advisee to colleague. It's a great it's a great story of academia and how how relationships of the mind form through the system of advising.
But we always say that, that you see people talk sometimes about the value of having a science buddy. And Gillian and I, we work together very closely, and we say we have a science buddy, and it makes everything so much more fun.
Right.
Yeah. We wrote the book together. We have about, I don't know, 30 or 40 papers together. We're organizing a huge conference together, so we do a lot together, and it really makes everything more enjoyable and more fun that you have somebody to share the load and someone to kind of give you a sense check on what you're thinking.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we'll definitely, uh, get into that as we talk about, the various aspects of memory in this book. But before jumping into the specifics of it, I was wondering if we could just start off with a question that sounds basic but is quite impossible to answer easily, which is, what is memory?
Well, I wouldn't say it's impossible. I've spent my career working on but
To answer easily.
yeah. So people use the word memory to mean a lot of different things, and it does cover a very wide variety of things. Um, so there's a lot of different kinds of memory. So people will often say, when they hear that we study memory, they'll often come to us and say, oh, I have a terrible memory. And what they mean by that is that they forget things, or they can't remember someone's name, or they forget to go to the post office, things like that. And they think that this is saying something really worrying about their memory. And we say, no, that's actually totally normal. That's just part of how memory works. So there are lots of different kinds of memory. There's, like working memory, like your ability to hold a phone number in mind. You look up a phone number and then you turn to your phone to dial it, and you have to hold those numbers in memory. That's like a kind of memory. There's prospective memory. So like remembering that you have to do something. And then there's things like procedural memory, like your vocabulary, knowing how to tie your shoelaces, knowing how to play the piano, all of those things that that are skills that you've learned. That's a kind of memory too. Um, but the kind of memory that we really focus on in our work is episodic memory. So memory for episodes, really. So for memory of things that have happened. And in particular, we really focus on an autobiographical memory. So memory for the events of your own life. And so that's the kind of memory that we study. And we try to study it in as a sort of ecologically valid a way as possible. So we try to study it in a way that wherever possible, that situates memory in its context. So we kind of try not to. Sometimes, for experimental control, we are experimental psychologists. We're running experiments. We're trying to test hypotheses, and you have to have certain controls in place. But we're trying to balance that need for control with that need for our results to actually make sense in the real world. That when you take them out of the lab and you look at it in the real world, that we're actually learning something about everyday memory.
Yeah, I'm sure that's when, figuring out how to design experiments properly to have it have that relevance is obviously extremely difficult, and a big issue in a lot of social sciences is that reproducibility.
Exactly, and a lot of the time it's kind of a matter of not there's no such thing as one experiment that will answer all those questions. It's about triangulating it. So maybe having one set of experiments that are very tightly controlled and maybe less ecologically valid, so less realistic, less naturalistic, but very tightly controlled. And then another set where maybe you have to sacrifice the control a little bit, but you get a bit more of that real world flavor. And then for trying to triangulate between those different kinds of studies so that we see, are the results all converging on a particular finding or a particular outcome.
But I think that most people, when they think of memory, they think of the memory as something that's going on inside the brain. And can you talk a little bit about the neural foundations of memory, the role that our brain plays in our memories, specifically the parts of it that are most relevant?
So there are different parts of the brain that are involved in different components of memory. One really important structure is the hippocampus, which is really deep in the center of the brain and in the medial temporal lobe. And we know that the hippocampus is where memories are formed. So where we create new memories. And memories really what they are is they're connections between they're kind of networks of connections between neurons, between brain cells. And it's the pattern of those connections is what creates a memory. So we know memories are originally formed in the hippocampus, and then over a period of time, through a process called consolidation, the memories become independent of the hippocampus. So we initially have those networks being formed within that little kind of nugget in the center of the brain, and then we see those connections being formed with areas wider, more distributed network outside the hippocampus, and eventually over time, those networks no longer need the hippocampus to be a part of it anymore, so they become independent. So by that point, then the memories aren't stored in one particular place in the brain; they're distributed throughout your whole brain, throughout in very wide networks throughout the brain. And when we go to remember something, from a neural perspective, what we're doing is we're actually reactivating those networks, those neural networks, and kind of recreating the sort of neural activity within those networks.
Yeah, but one of the stories that you tell that I think is really fascinating for just giving some insight into how memory works is the story of, and I'm going to butcher the name, Henry Molaison, better known in the scientific literature as HM. So I think it's great. What I love about this book is, and what's a lot of this sort of work is done through particular case studies of very interesting or unusual human beings who end up even through their suffering or through their unique conditions, they contribute to scientific research. So could you tell us a little about HM and his story?
Yeah, so Henry Molaison was a young man, and he'd had, this is in the 1950s, he had very, very severe epilepsy. He'd had it most of his life, and his doctors weren't totally sure what caused it, but they probably figured they kind of traced it really to a bike accident that he'd had when he was about 10. So since then, he'd had this extremely severe form of epilepsy where he was having multiple seizures every day, and they were, it was just very debilitating. It was taking over his life. And this is, I was saying, in the 1950s, so before the advent of the kinds of seizure control medication that's available now. So there really wasn't much that the doctors were able to do for him. And like a lot of people with epilepsy, HM's seizures were largely localized to the temporal lobe in the brain. And of course, I mentioned earlier that the hippocampus is a region in the medial temporal lobe. So it's in that part of the brain, kind of in the inside, deeper part of that lobe. So after, it got to a point where in his mid-20s where Henry's life really wasn't livable. He was having seizures every time, like multiple times a day. He couldn't live independently. He couldn't really hold down a job. So his surgeon, William Scoville, offered to perform a really experimental radical surgery where they would remove essentially a large chunk of the brain, a big piece of that medial temporal lobe area where a lot of the seizure activity seemed to originate. So they did this, so Henry, agreed to it, and they removed on both the hippocampus on both sides of the brain, and also some other structures in the medial temporal lobe, most of the amygdala, the perirhinal cortex, and so on. And, so this was obviously hugely experimental. Nobody knew what would happen. Would Henry survive this surgery? And he did. He survived it. And moreover, it was a huge success. His epilepsy was actually cured. It did stop the seizure activity. So, big green mark, big check mark there for William Scoville. But there was a downside. And the downside was that after the surgery, Henry was no longer able to form new memories. So all his memories, his kind of long-term memories of his life up to, shortly before the surgery, those were still intact. So he could remember, all like the normal events of his previous, his life up to date. His procedural memory was still intact. So he could still tie his shoelaces and ride a bike, and he could still, speak very fluently and, all of that. What he wasn't able to do was to form new memories. So if you had a conversation with Henry, he would sit in front of you and he would talk to you perfectly normally. He was very nice, very polite man. And then you might come back 30 seconds later and he'd have no recollection of ever having met you. And he wouldn't be able to store those memories. So there were a lot of people who studied him for many, many years. He would have met them dozens of times. He'd have no memory of ever having met them. He was told many, many times he would ask, where was his favorite uncle? And every time he'd be told that his uncle had died, and every time the grief would be just as fresh because he had no memory of having been told this ever before. So Henry's story was very dramatic, but what was really important about it was that it showed that connection that I talked about earlier between memory and the hippocampus. So prior to this case, psychologists and neurologists didn't know for sure that the hippocampus was this really critical element in memory. But Henry's case, where the hippocampus was removed and suddenly he's no longer able to form new memories, shows us really, really clearly both what the hippocampus does and also what it doesn't do. Because the fact that Henry was no longer able to form new memories tells us that this is the area where new memories are formed. But the fact that he hasn't lost his previous memories or his procedural memories tells us that this is not where those memories are stored long term. That any of those memories that had been consolidated so that they had been distributed out through the rest of the brain, those were preserved. Some of his more recent memories, so things that had happened in maybe the week or so before the surgery, some of those were lost as well. And that was because the consolidation process there was still going on. So those memories were still partially dependent on the hippocampus. So those memories were lost too. So, it was obviously a huge change in Henry's life. And obviously, he was no longer, of course, able to live independently. He spent most of his life living in an institution or living with his family. But it is also just an enormously important case in terms of what our understanding about the neurology of memory.
It's an utterly fascinating story and really just remarkable. And it makes me wonder or think about how my own memories are stored. So example, like I think about, childhood memories of being at an amusement park as a kid and, pulling on that memory from the past, the way that certain things are very vivid and other things I couldn't even begin to tell you. Like I have no memory of going to the amusement park. I have memory of being there, memory of being on a roller coaster. It seemed very big and scary, but then I have no idea how I got back or what I ate or all these other sorts of things. So how is that memory stored? What is that, what sort of sense of how that actually gets stored in the brain and how we then recall it or remember it? What are like the atoms in a way of memory?
Well, so that like the as I say, the memories are stored in these patterns of neural connections, and you can think of these as being almost like little roads that you travel down to get to a memory. And some of those areas, if you like, if you imagine like you're looking at a map, and you picture, say like I don't know, look at a map of the United States, okay, and you can see all the roads going to different cities. And there are some places, let's say like New York City has thousands of roads leading to it. Everything seems to be converging on it. There are so many different paths and routes to that location. Whereas there might be some other, tiny town in Iowa that only has one road going into it. Okay. And it's unlikely that somebody is going to stumble across that road unless they're looking for it. And our memories kind of work the same way, that those patterns, those networks that we have of those neural connections, some of those are more tightly interconnected with other memories than others are. Others are kind of have much fewer connections, have fewer associations with other parts of our lives. So memory works in this very associative way. So if you're thinking of something that has a lot of those connections and a lot of associations, that's going to be very easily triggered by other incidents in your life, by emotions, by other events that you think of, by words, by smells, by a lot of different kinds of things that might trigger that neural network. And whereas others have fewer connections to them, so they're less likely to be triggered. I think an important thing to talk about, though, when we talk about memory is we talk about retrieving memory, and we often tend to think about this as though our memory is just stored somewhere and it's locked down in kind of some kind of crystallized form, and then we can just go and retrieve it. So people will often think about memory as being like a book that you take off a shelf and you open it up and there's the event. Or maybe it's depending on your age, either it's a filing cabinet or it's a file on a computer, and you go and you open this file and it's just a matter of kind of search and retrieval, and there it is. But actually what we know about memory is that it's not this passive retrieval process, that actually memory is a very active process. That when we go to remember something, we don't just, take that book off the shelf. We're actually writing that book. We're actively reconstructing the stories of our lives. We're actively reconstructing our memories. So we prefer the metaphor of thinking of memory as being like a Lego tower. So when you go to remember something, you're not just, taking that tower out fully built out of storage, you're actually rebuilding it. You're building it from its bricks, from its component parts. And when we do this, we're not kind of, reinventing the wheel here. We're not building that tower from scratch every single time. We have blueprints. We have an expectation of what that tower should look like. And we use those mental blueprints, which we call schemas, to help us decide how that memory should look, what components it should have, which elements are likely to be in it, what kind of general structure it'll have. And it's this kind of very efficient system that helps us to recognize the commonalities among all of our memories, and helps us kind of much more easily and efficiently retrieve memories. So far, so good. The downside is that sometimes this kind of reconstructive approach can lead to us having flaws in our memories or errors in our memories. So when you rebuild that Lego tower, you might leave some bricks out. You might forget to put some pieces in. So there's some details now that are missing in your memory. Or you might say, okay, well, this is what my Lego tower usually looks like. This is what my blueprint looks like. And you build your tower according to that blueprint. So then when you do that, sometimes you've kind of missed out some kind of funny little detail about how your original tower was. It was shaped slightly differently. It looked a little bit off. So it looks now maybe more like the standard blueprint of what you expect rather than what actually happened. And then the third thing that can happen is that somebody can hand you a brick and say, here, does this go in your tower? And if it feels like it might fit, you'll slot it in. So this is something that will frequently happen if we're talking to someone else about an event and they say they kind of drop some hint about something that happened. And it's not actually something we originally remember, but we take that little brick of memory and we slot it into our reconstructed memory tower. So when we do that, sometimes that memory can end up being a little bit different to the event that actually happened.
So when we think about the way that memory changes, does it have to do with necessarily, let's say, the emotional state that a person was having when the memory was initially being formed, or the event that the memory is remembering? For example, if we were in a manic state, a depressed state, a neutral state, or is it, the active memory? It can be that not necessarily the actual how we were feeling at the event mattered as much as the act of remembering.
So a bit of both. Emotion is important in memory. I say, like, memory is associative, and one of the things that can trigger the way we remember things is emotion. So, for example, one of the most important elements with emotion is this congruity between your current emotional state and the state in which you initially experienced an event. So if you're currently feeling sad, for example, you will find it easier to recall previous incidents where you felt sad. Okay. And if you're feeling happy, you'll find it easier to recall previous incidents where you've had a similar feeling. And that's essentially, if you can imagine that idea of like that big network in your brain. We imagine it as being almost like a spider's web. Okay. And let's say you have that emotional node, let's say that node of happiness, and that's associated, that's linked with all different events in which you had a similar emotional reaction. So it's easier to recall events when you're in a similar emotional state. That's one part of it. And another thing is that sometimes our emotional state can influence how we encode a memory in the first place. So a lot of the time when people talk about there being problems with their memory, I can't remember what happened in this time, or I can't remember this particular incident. The issue isn't your memory at all. The issue isn't that you can't remember it. The issue is that you didn't encode it in the first place. You weren't paying attention. And that's normal, because we are constantly surrounded with just a huge onslaught of sensory information. And we have a very limited kind of bandwidth of the amount of information that we can pay attention to at any one time. So attention is really important here. Attention is like the filter that determines what will go into your memory in the first place. So you can only pay attention to a certain amount of things. If your attention is distracted by something big and loud going on here, you're not going to notice something that happens over at the other side of the room. Okay. And then that means that later on, when someone says, well, what happened on the other side of the room? And you're going, oh my God, why can't I remember? So, well, why would you remember? You never saw it. It's like the TV was turned to a different channel. You didn't see it. Why would you remember it? Okay. So we have these expectations where we think we should be able to remember things that we never actually encoded in the first place. And emotion can interact with that. So if you're very anxious, very stressed, for example, you'll often find that your attentional state, you'll kind of get this sort of zoomed in attention. So your attentional kind of, imagine, you can think of attention as being like a zoom lens on a camera. And sometimes it can zoom in really tight. Other times it can kind of zoom out into take in a kind of a wide perspective. When we're stressed, when we're anxious, our attention will also often zoom in. So there's a really nice study where the researchers brought participants in to get, to kind of under the guise of getting an inoculation. And they took their heart rate before and after they got the inoculation in order to assess who found this kind of a stressful experience. So people whose heart rate went up, and when they had to get the inoculation and then it came back down again, those were people who were kind of very reactive. So people maybe who were afraid of needles and found this to be a very stressful experience. Other people didn't have a problem with needles, weren't reactive, their heart rate stayed pretty steady. And what they found was that the participants who had that kind of emotional stress reaction to getting the injection, later on they gave them a surprise test and they asked them to identify the nurse who'd given them the injection. And the people who'd been really stressed were much worse at identifying the nurse. They were sitting with her in the same room, but their attention was zoomed in on the needle and they weren't paying attention to her face. They weren't encoding those details. So then later they were going to have more trouble retrieving that. So emotion can interact with attention and then with memory in a lot of interesting ways.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So in general, multitasking, not a very good approach to doing things if you need to remember what you're doing.
It depends. So multitasking, we're going to get into a whole attention thing here, which is also really interesting. Multitasking a lot of the time people use that term to mean a lot of things, but really what I would always say is we're definitely able to do multiple things at once. What we're not able to do is to pay attention to multiple things at once. So, for example, it's totally possible for you to walk down the street while listening to a podcast. Okay. You don't trip over your feet while you're doing it. You manage to avoid other pedestrians. You manage to take all the turns that you want to take, all of that. You're not kind of consciously trying to think, now, how do I lift my feet up and how do I put them down? And is it heel first or is it toe first? Okay. But if you did do that, if you suddenly switched to trying to concentrate on your feet, then you wouldn't be able to pay attention to the podcast anymore. Okay. Because you're switching where your conscious attention is. So where multitasking does work is if one of the tasks that we're doing is automatic, is procedural. So if it's something that you've learned to do so well that you can do it without conscious attention, like walking, for example. But then if you look at, say, a toddler who's learning to walk and they need to put all of their conscious attention into walking, and if you distract them while they're walking, they're going to fall down because they have to consciously attend to it. So multitasking is fine if you are trying to do one thing that you're consciously attending to and other things that you can do without paying much attention to. Another really good example that a lot of people will have experience of is driving. When you're first learning to drive, it can be a really overwhelming experience. And remember, I grew up in Europe where everybody learns to drive manual cars. So there's a lot more things to do. You have to change the gears. You've got the clutch. You've got all these different, you have 3 pedals instead of 2. You've got a lot of things to think about. So you'll often see learner drivers, cutting out at the traffic lights and they get, confused and they get flustered and they can't pay attention. If anybody distracts you when you're learning to drive, everything becomes a disaster. Okay, you can't figure out what you're doing anymore. The car stalls, terrible things happen. But now, you're an experienced driver. You can drive from your home to your work and your work to your home and have no recollection of that route. You didn't pay any attention to what was happening. And yet you did it all perfectly safely. You stopped at traffic lights, you let pedestrians go, you took all the correct turns, you didn't crash the car, but you can't remember a single thing about your route because you didn't need to consciously attend to it. And it's that conscious attention that's necessary for us to encode that information into memory.
That makes so much sense. Even on like a personal level, I love to, as might be no surprise, listen to podcasts. And I love to go and walk while I do it. And I find that I enjoy doing it most just doing the same exact route that I typically do, because then I don't need to think about it. It's not like I'll be in a new area and I'll be like, oh, I have no idea where I am. And now I have to start paying attention to street signs to figure out where I'm going.
Yeah. Or you might even do that thing I often find. I'll be listening to a podcast and I'm enjoying it, but then I start thinking about something and I have to turn off the podcast because I can't think about whatever I'm thinking about and listen at the same time. Because those both I can walk while I'm listening to the podcast, but I can't think about something else. So you can do 2 things at once. You just can't think about 2 things at once.
Right. That makes so much sense. One thing that I find really interesting about this book is the focus on forgetting. And forgetting is in many ways the flip side of memory. And I'm wondering, what does it actually mean to forget? It doesn't say, what you're describing before of this kind of unconscious, you're using your procedural memory, not your episodic, it's not episodic memory. So you're not going to remember it. That seems very different than forgetting. Or maybe people say, oh, I forgot this, but like you said, they never remembered it in the first place. So they didn't really forget it. So what does it actually mean to forget?
Firstly, I suppose there's when people use the term forget, they mean it in one of 2 ways. They either mean I forgot something that happened to me. So I've forgotten someone's name, or I've forgotten how I got to the amusement park. Or sometimes they mean I'm forgetting to do something. So I keep forgetting to go to the post office. I've had that package in my car for a week and I keep forgetting to go to the post office. So that's a failure of prospective memory of where you're planning to do something. But I think what we're talking about here is mostly that first kind. So you've forgotten something that happened in the past. Okay. So there's kind of a lot of things that lead to this. So people often think of forgetting as being this really negative thing. Like we have this unrealistic expectations of our own memory, that we should be like a computer recording system, that we should be able to have everything we've ever done, every event we've ever experienced, every conversation we've ever had, every bowl of cornflakes we've ever eaten should be recorded in high resolution detail in our brains. But that would be an awful waste of our cognitive resources if you want to think of it like a computer metaphor, it's like a waste of hard drive. Okay. And it's also a waste of RAM. It's a waste of that kind of conscious attention. So there's a few things that happen when we forget. A lot of it is say when people say, I forgot that, it's that they never encoded it at all. But a lot of the time people do forget things that they did encode, something you once knew and you don't know anymore. Okay, like you learned something for an exam, you passed the exam, and now you've forgotten the details. Some of those are, it's just that they're, I talked about earlier on about memory being like a map, and it's like this, like one of those destinations that doesn't have many roads to it. So, you might come across that information once, it might be stored in there somewhere, it's just not easily accessible. But a lot of the time, what happens is that we have experiences that have an awful lot in common with each other. And one of the things that happens over time is we have this sort of mental digestion process that recognizes the commonality among all of these events and sort of gets rid of a lot of the details and strips out the gist to maintain the kind of the underlying commonalities. So an example might be, if you think about what you ate for breakfast this morning, you probably eat breakfast every morning. Okay, so you probably get up every day, you sit at the same place, you eat more or less the same thing. It's not really a good use of your resources for you to remember every single bite of cereal, exactly what the temperature was of the milk, how many bites it took you to finish the bowl, all of this. It's not a good use of your mental resources. What's important is more that you extract the gist. I usually eat cornflakes for breakfast. Okay. So you have that gist, and then you have this, like I said earlier, that kind of blueprint, that schema of what breakfast for you is like. And your schema of breakfast will be different to mine because, I don't really eat breakfast as it happens. So, your schema of breakfast is going to be maybe influenced by your normal day-to-day life. And then what that means is that maybe there might be some day that where things stand out and you remember it because it's different from schema in some way. But most of the time, all that's important for you to know is that I usually eat cornflakes for breakfast. So we're kind of clearing out, I suppose, if you like, a lot of kind of that unnecessary cognition that we don't need to have about every single bite of cornflakes you've ever eaten. It's not a good use of our time or of our limited cognitive resources. But forgetting also has a lot of really important benefits. So like being able to forget is actually really valuable. And sometimes people are very surprised to hear that. There are people who have these wonderful memories. So there's people who have something called highly superior autobiographical memory. And these are people who can remember every detail of their lives. So like they can tell you exactly what they ate for breakfast every day. They can tell you what they did every Tuesday since 1991, so like what the weather was like, everything, it's extraordinary detail. But like there's kind of good evidence with a lot of those people that what's happening there isn't really this extraordinary ability to remember. It's an inability to forget. That they're not doing is engaging in that sort of boiling down mental digestion process that we actually really should be doing with our memories. And one of the side effects of that is there's not that many of these people, so there's not a huge amount of research on it. But anecdotally, one of the things with these people seems to be that they often have a lot of trouble moving on from difficult times in their lives. Because, for most of us, time is a great healer. Over time, the sting of rejection fades, the pain of a breakup, the argument that you had with your sibling, it kind of fades into time with time and it becomes less important. Whereas if you remember everything that's just as vividly as you remembered it the first time, then you never get over that argument you had with your brother when you were 10. You never get over that breakup. It still hurts just as much as it ever did. And it's very hard to move on and maintain kind of good mental health. So there's a lot of benefits to, kind of forgetting things as well.
So we should stop worrying and learn to love forgetting, would you say?
Yeah, better than learning to love the bomb anyway.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah, look, I think our message a lot of the time is really that our memories are very flexible and they're very adaptive. And that's actually a feature, not a bug. Our memories evolved to be very flexible. And we didn't evolve to be computer recording systems. And that's probably not what we would want. So maybe we would suggest is, have a little bit more humility about your memory and offer a little bit more grace to other people about their memories. That we shouldn't expect either our memory or someone else's memory to be perfect and flawless. That's just not how our memories have evolved. It's not how they're built.
So you mentioned it a few times in the book, but you bring up, Plato and Socrates and their famous, obviously Plato uses Socrates as a mouthpiece. Who knows if Socrates existed? Maybe he did. But they lament writing. They say writing is bad for memory because you're externalizing your memory essentially, and you're not practicing using it. And obviously we have so many different new technologies beyond writing. We have calendars to remember what we should be doing. We have calculators to remember how to multiply and add. We have cell phones for everything, computers for everything. How does how do these digital technologies impact our memory?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. Yes, yes, technology, all different kinds of aids that we can use for our memories do interact with our memory. But again, I think it comes back to this idea of flexibility, that our memories are very flexible, our brains are flexible, and we can decide where we're going to devote our cognitive resources. So I should say Plato was terribly concerned that people were going to, and essentially become stupider if because writing was going to make people become stupider, that they wouldn't be able to remember. I'm not sure anybody now, 3,000 years later, is saying that writing is a terrible invention and really we should get rid of it. I think we probably accept that the benefits that come from writing exceed any potential damage to our memories, and then indeed we can still remember things. And what we do though is we have, when new technologies come along, they allow us to sort of offload certain tasks. And some of these are really this kind of this process of cognitive offloading is not specific to technology. It's just as new tools arrive, we can do it in different ways. So people, for example, will often take notes rather than remembering something. You might be in a meeting and you might take notes rather than remembering something. Now maybe you record the meeting instead. Not really any different. It's still offloading the task of remembering these details from your mind to it's almost like extending the space of your mind and saying, I'm offloading this to my notepad, my computer, whatever it might be. We see this in some interesting ways with technology. So there's something called the photo impairment effect. If you take a photograph of an event or, a scene, later you'll recall that detail, that scene or that event in less detail than if you actually just were watching it yourself, because you have sort of offloaded the job of remembering that to your camera. And it's something, when I started learning about that, it's something I started thinking about more. And I take my phone out less to take photographs of things, because I'll think, I'm never really going to look at that photo again, but I actually do want to attend to this experience and remember it myself. So I'm at a concert and I'm looking around and everyone has their phones out. And I'm like, you paid €100 to be at this concert. Did you really do that so you could watch it through a 4-inch screen later? Or did you do that so that you could be here and experience it? So why are you offloading that unless that's going to be valuable to you later? You can engage with that experience now and then you're still there. So that's one example. Another example, if you use a sat nav to drive around a city, say to get to an unfamiliar location, and then later I test you about, the directions and how you're going to get there. If you use the sat nav, you won't remember as well as if you had to figure it out by yourself. Okay. And the difficulty though is, the issue I suppose is whether you think that's a problem. If I'm, kind of using the sat nav to, facilitate my getting to my destination more quickly, more easily, I'm fine with that. I don't actually feel that I need to remember in great detail how exactly I drove from here to there. It doesn't really matter to me. Whereas maybe remembering the concert that I spent €100 on the ticket for, that does matter to me. So we can choose which of these things we're going to offload. But that doesn't, engaging in that kind of offloading, it's not like our brains rust, it's not like we've by using sat nav today that I've lost my ability to navigate myself tomorrow, or by taking a photograph today, I haven't lost my ability to remember a landscape tomorrow. And we're just using the tools we have available in a very flexible way.
So, there's a lot in this book that, we haven't been able to cover in this interview. You talk about eyewitness accounts, why eyewitness isn't always very effective, why it's still important, but not always effective. And many other things you talk about aging and the brain. But, I really recommend that listeners, if they found this conversation interesting, really go pick up the book, because there's so much that we weren't able to talk about. And this book really does encapsulate, I think, the most up-to-date research and evidence about how memory works, how forgetting works. But, the note that I want to just kind of leave listeners off on is, if there's something that, because there's so many misconceptions around this topic, if there's one thing that they should remember about their memory, what would that be?
One thing you should remember about your memory is that that your memory is not designed or has not evolved to be a perfect recording system. So if we come back to that idea earlier, that if remembering something is like taking a book off a shelf, we're not reading that book, we're writing it. we're actively engaged in that process of constructing our own memories, and we're actively engaged in writing the story of our own lives. And that means that we have a lot of control over how we choose to remember our lives, and we structure those in a way that will support our lives and support us to survive and thrive. So I would say, and like value your memory for what it is, and don't expect it to be what it isn't.
Yeah, that's I found a lot of the what you write about in this book extremely reassuring, because sometimes I do worry. I'm like, am I losing it? Is my because I can't remember what I ate for breakfast last week. Um,
But do you need to? Do you really need to know whether you had cornflakes or toast?
you don't. It reminds me a little bit of something that my physics teacher in high school said with respect to calculators, where he basically said that because of calculators and the internet, we have no excuse not to be able to remember the difficult things. So
Yeah.
if you can just, you don't need to memorize 47 times 12. You can just put in your calculator, but you should remember, how to do the proof of something, or you should remember how to,
Yeah. You still need
how
to
to
know why
simplify
you're
an
doing
equation.
that.
Exactly.
It's that,
Yeah.
it's that whole like, we often like, say we have, students, and we teach them to use statistics programs. I mean, they could do their statistics by hand, but like, honestly, like, why? We have statistics programs, we put the numbers in. The important thing isn't, plugging in the numbers and getting out values. The important thing is interpreting that and understanding what it means and why you're doing it. And that applies across the board with our memory, that it is, yeah, but like if you can use a tool to kind of automate the more boring parts of life, then that maybe that frees up some cognitive space for you to engage in something else. Or, maybe just to play more Candy Crush. I don't know.
Yeah, there's you can you can use the tool, the brain, in many different ways. Remember all sorts of facts. Well, Ciara, it's so wonderful to speak with you about Memory Lane, the perfectly imperfect ways you remember. I really recommend listeners go and pick up the book. It's really just well written and very fascinating. So thank you so much.
Thank you.